president of the local society. And we welcome you to join us this evening for the first of 4 lectures this spring in February, March, April, and May, always as usual at 6:30 p.m. on the 3rd Thursday of the month. This year, our first 2 lectures will be virtual this evening, and in March, I'll speak about the March lecture in a few minutes. And we're hoping, if all goes well, to have hybrid lectures in April and May. We just need to see. It's, as they say in the business, it's an evolving situation. And we simply have to do our best. We do appreciate your patience, however, and we're glad that you could join us this evening in, I think, what is going to be an excellent talk. We, of course, are disappointed that Dr. Dicus could not join us in person. But we will get him up here in person at some point. We're just glad to have him back. Some of you might recognize him from 2 years ago now, when he spoke about his work in Pompeii, and he gave an excellent lecture in April of 2020 on the fascinating plaster casts that have been found in Pompeii since the mid-19th century. That have been made there. So anyways, we'll get on to the lecture shortly. I'd just like to introduce our society to those of you just joining us or new to the society. First of all, I'd like to point out that the following is a live presentation and recording is strictly prohibited. The AIA respects the intellectual property of its presenters and asks the viewers to do the same. So thank you in advance for your cooperation. For those of you unfamiliar with the AIA, we make archaeology happen, and we've been doing it for a long time, really going on, getting close to 150 years. It's the largest and oldest archaeological organization in the United States, and we have long supported archaeologists as well as educators in a wide range of tasks. We have several journals for those of you interested in learning more about archaeology. Of course, Archaeology Magazine, available on the newsstand. We have close to 750,000 readers, excellent articles. And for those of you joining us early today, our thanks to Cindy Bell for putting together recent highlights featured in Archaeology Magazine. They often give the 10 most interesting finds of the year. And this is the kind of material which is both fun to read and educational, which you can find in archaeology. For those who want more, there is the American Journal of Archaeology, which is now digital as well, goes into great depth on some of the more immediate and important archaeological finds across the Mediterranean and throughout the world. We have lots going on usually. We're hoping that, like the rest of the world, things will open up soon. For those interested in, for example, excavating, there are still excavations open. If you go to the archaeological page, and there you see the address on the bottom, www.archaeological.org, you can go to the field bulletin, the AFOB, which has opportunities for those wishing to go abroad. There are also archaeology tours. There's quite a bit there, as well as material in all kinds of local societies. So we encourage you to go look at the site. We also encourage you to consider a membership. And consider joining us on Facebook, which is where you can find much of the information. We're hoping soon to roll out a Spokane Society web page, but for now, information about our upcoming lectures can be found on the Spokane Society Facebook page, and again, we encourage you to like us. Your membership to the AIA is, of course, important for keeping lectures like this coming, keeping them free, and keeping them open to the public. And we hope that you will think about supporting the AIA. You can find more information about membership on the AIA national website, and we hope you'll consider it. Those of you who are members, thank you very much for continuing your membership or becoming new members, and we hope that you will continue to do so as we roll out what I think is a wonderful lecture series this spring. If you have questions for our speaker, and many of you do, please don't forget that on Zoom here we have a chat box. You'll see a little sign that looks just like the one next to the Q&A period. Just click on that. You can type in your questions. and we will answer them in the order that they're received. At the end of the talk, I will read off those questions and give our speaker an opportunity to answer those which you've come up with. So enter those at any time you'd like during the course of the talk or at the end of the talk, and we will have a question period later on. We do have closed captioning, so for those of you who would like this, you can find it at the icon at the bottom, the little CC icon. You just click on that. It'll allow you to put the subtitle settings on. It'll also allow you to enlarge those subtitles and to make them at a level point size that's comfortable. So if you're unaware of this particular button, we encourage you to use that for anyone who might need it. Interestingly enough, the AIEA gave a lecture at the National Convention. The national lecture is always given in early January, in which they had sign language. We have never received a request for sign language, but for those of you who might be interested in that or think that that's a good idea, it is something that we might consider in the future in order to allow our lectures to go to the widest possible audience. In any case, our next lecture is coming up in a month, and March 17th, we're very pleased to welcome back another of our recent lecturers, Dr. Cyrus Conrad from the University of New Mexico. He's a Spokenite, so we're very pleased to be able to bring him back. You might remember his talk, it was a couple of Thanksgivings ago when he talked about turkey raising here in the New World. It was a great talk, and of course, many of us see these beasts running around our neighborhoods on a daily basis. Of course, he's doing some very interesting work that he recently published on World War II and the bridge over the River Kwai movie. An archaeologist was involved in that. It's quite a tale of woe, and yet as well as a very heartening one. And led to some tremendous advancements in the study of prehistoric Thailand. So I hope that you'll join us and welcome back again, Dr. Cyrus Conrad, to speak with us in a month from now. We have two other lectures coming up this spring. Again, on the third Thursday, we have an AIA National Talk by Dr. Stephen Nash, Why We Repatriate. And this is on the NAGPRA Act. And they're talking about 15 years of restorative justice at the Denver Museum. For those of you interested in this particular topic, it's a very timely one, and we hope that you will join us to hear what Dr. Nash has to say. We hope to make this live. That is our hope. We're crossing our fingers. If not, we will go virtual. Even if we go live, we're hoping to do it hybrid. So for those of you who wish to remain at home, we still hope to offer that service. We'll talk about this more again as the situation unfolds. Please check out our Facebook page for the most recent updates. Finally, on May 21st, Dr. Gloria London, who has not spoken to us for many years, but we're very pleased to have her back, in a lecture in memory of Dr. Sarah Keller, who was a professor emerita at EWU. We're very pleased to have her back to talk about her work in Cyprus. In fact, I'd just like to take a moment to thank the generous donors who have made this spring 2022 series possible. We are always very, very thankful to our donors. And this spring, I'd like to personally thank, and on behalf of the board and myself, James Watts, George Halikas, Carl and Suzanne Fleming, and supporting the lecture for Dr. Keller, Fred and Catherine Lauritsen. Thank you again. For those of you who wish to help support our society, we are always pleased for your support. And should you be interested, please drop me a line. You can find me at goldman@gonzaga.edu. Okay. And now on to the main lecture. I'm very excited to welcome this evening Dr. Kevin Dicus at the University of Oregon, where he has taught since 2015, and where he came from. He was up at Case Western Reserve before moving out to the Pacific Northwest and joining our archaeology community. Professor Dicus received his PhD from the Interdepartmental Program of Classical Art and Archaeology at the University of Michigan, one of the storied programs in the United States. and he received his undergraduate degrees at the University of Arizona. He joined the Department of Classics at the University of Gorgon, as I said, in 2015, and he teaches a wide range of topics on the ancient Mediterranean, as well as Latin, literature courses, and I've been told this quarter, a 200-person class on mythology, teaching to a very large number of students who I'm sure are very fortunate to have him as their teacher. Because his primary interests are quite wide-ranging. It's the archaeology of Italy, but he has excavated in a number of very important sites, including Pompeii, since 2006. He worked at the Porta Stabia project, and he has a number of other smaller projects going on, including Roman villas in the Tolfa Mountains north of Rome, which we're hoping to hear, I guess, a bit about this evening. And he has spoken about this before. We thought it would be wonderful to have him talk on a subject that we haven't had in a long time, the Etruscans. And so I'm very, very pleased to introduce Dr. Kevin Dicus, who will speak this evening on continuity and change in Etruscan religion under Roman hegemony. Please welcome Dr. Dicus.
Great. Thank you very much for introducing me. I'm going to share this screen. Great. Is that available? You can see. Great. Wonderful. Thank you, Andrew, for inviting me. And thank you all for attending. And also thank you for telling me about that closed caption feature. I had no idea. So I'm going to use that myself when I'm doing my own, hosting my own Zoom talks here. Right, we will be talking about the Tolfa region. This is a place near and dear to my heart. And we're going to be using a case study there to look at change and continuity in Etruscan religion under Roman hegemony. So this talk really will look at changes in cult practices. We tend to think that a relationship to the gods is so culturally and individually ingrained that changes to its form and rituals signal deep disruptions, internal like schisms, or external like socio-political upheavals brought on by foreign hegemonic powers or conquest. Now, Iron Age Italy is the perfect laboratory to observe religious continuity and change over the longue durée, since it was an international stage where many peoples met, exchanged goods and ideas, fought and conquered. Etruscan religion is the wonderful test subject because the archaeological record detects the continuity and change of their practices as these outside peoples came into and expanded around Italy. For example, the Phoenicians and the Greeks, and of course, the Roman expansion in the second half of the first millennium BC. Often changes are seen to signal emulation and acculturation. The local peoples recognize the superiority of the outsiders, or they simply see the benefit in being more like them, and they gradually became them, adopting not just ways of being, but ways of believing. To examine continuity and change in an Etruscan context and the reasons behind them, I want to start with an overview of some of the features of Etruscan religion that I feel are most salient to this examination, namely how they viewed their gods and what was the process behind developing a relationship with them. I will then introduce examples of how these features endured or changed as contact with Greeks and Phoenicians intensified in Italy. But really my main concern is the continuity and change of Etruscan religion during and after the Roman occupation of Italy. There's a tendency to see Rome's presence changing not only the political structures, but really the identities of these conquered peoples. They became Romanized. Roman expansion and hegemony essentially overpowered local cultural identities. It was like a centrifugal movement of cultural institutions and beliefs, all sorts of modes of living from this enlightened center, which is Rome, and covered these dark peripheries, right? And the movement was also unilateral. The culture from the peripheries were not strong enough really to reach and influence the center. Well, this is all wrong. I think it's way too simplistic. And instead, I want to stress that there was no overarching imperial strategy to homogenize and Romanize the conquered peoples. Likewise, the native response to conquest extended beyond outright acceptance or, on the opposite side, wholesale resistance. Instead, there was flexibility, which enabled both conquerors and conquered to respond and react as necessary to myriad possibilities that imperialism engendered. For the Etruscans, this flexibility was granted by the autonomy they maintained to evaluate foreign customs and to adapt and refashion those which seemed advantageous to them. New rituals were taken up not to replace traditional belief systems, but to enhance them and provide a novel way to manage one's own relationship with the divinities. To illustrate this, part 2 of the talk will examine a ritual that encompassed Italy at the same time as Rome's expansion, a ritual where terracotta body parts began to be dedicated in sanctuaries throughout Italy. In particular, I want to introduce a small group of votive heads recovered from the sanctuary at Crescetta dei Cavallari, one sanctuary I studied quite extensively in the Tolfa Mountain region. Through these heads, I argue we can better understand the scope of the religious Romanization of Italy. I will attempt to show that while indigenes participated in this Roman cult, they did so with one foot firmly planted in a traditional belief system and aesthetic repertoire. Participation is not a de facto indication of Romanization. Rather than acculturation and emulation, we are more correct to view changes from these interactions as processes of adaptation and negotiation. So I want to begin with archaeological evidence of early cult practice found at Tarquinia. Here we can detect the nascent ideas about the nature of the gods, how they were accessed, and who acted on behalf of the communities. Many of these basic structures endured, even when outside influences brought other changes to their religious forms. Now, archaeological evidence of the early cult activity comes from the civic and sacred monumental complex at Tarquinia. And this was Tarquinia became a vital capital city in the Etruscan Federation. Here, a cavity in the bedrock took on sacred importance for the worship of perhaps a chthonic deity as early as the 10th century BCE, which is evident by the presence of Villanovan material culture thrown in as offerings. A monumental complex later grew around the cavity. So its ritual importance was now expressed and enhanced through its central position among these structures. One structure, so what we call the building beta here, there's a reconstruction of it on the upper right, was built in the early 7th century BCE, and it demonstrates that inhabitants still, hundreds of years later, recognize the power of this cavity. They had built a channel which drew liquid offerings from building beta to this cavity. So what this is telling us already is for the Etruscans, the world around them, these springs and mountaintops and yes, cavities in the bedrock possessed a supernatural force. These deities were more in the beginning animistic than anthropomorphic. They inhabited space everywhere and they were very mysterious. Now, 2 ritual depositions here help us to understand more how they viewed and communicated with these forces. The first on the left is a burial from the 9th century BCE, and it was located next to or nearby the cavity. And this was intentional. It is a child for about 8 or 9 years old, and a forensic examination indicates the child was encephalopathic and epileptic. The child, because of these medical conditions, likely was thought to have had some special connection to the divine sphere during and because of these epileptic bouts. Perhaps he was associated with Tages, a child prophet whose revelations were the foundation of Etruscan religion. Now, the second deposit appears at the entrance of building Beta. In the 7th century BCE, bronze instruments ritually destroyed were placed in a pit, including an axe, a shield with a hammered orientalizing motif, and a lichuus, which is a sort of horn. Excavators interpreted this offering as representing the civic, military, and religious authority of a ruler of the newly formed city of Tarquinia. Now, I bring up this site and these two discoveries among so many I could have brought up because they encapsulate features of Etruscan religion that endured with remarkable continuity over these subsequent centuries of great socio-political change. First, it took preternatural skill to understand the will of these animistic divinities. Etruscan religion was essentially a revealed one, meaning one had to interpret obscure signs and portents, like perhaps that child over here was thought to do. If you want a good life, you got to figure out what the gods want. And second, the ability to read these portents was available to a select few, a priestly class who was trained for this role. Very important, as these fine bronze instruments show, is that the aristocratic and priestly classes were one and the same. The elite controlled much of society's relationship with the gods. They acted as middlemen. They in turn benefited as their central role in the religious life of everybody, cemented their status as aristocratic leaders. So there was no distinction between politics and religion. Now, the foundational event in Etruscan religion was the revelation of the Etrusca disciplina by an autochthonous god-child named Tages. And this engraved in Taglio gemstone might show this very scene, this child rising from the ground, appearing to Tarchon, the founder of Tarquinia. The Etrusca disciplina were prophetic texts teaching mortals. We don't really know exactly. We're relying on writings centuries later in the Roman period and the late antique period to tell us what they were. But they seem to have taught the regions of the sky and the earth and which particular divinity controlled each region. And that they taught processes of divination by interpreting thunder and lightning, entrails of animals, especially livers, flights of birds, and rituals for founding cities. Not all mortals received this wisdom. Tarchon was said to have passed the knowledge on to other princes, and aristocratic families kept it close to their chest, passing it down their line. Again, religion and politics are inextricable. I'm going to repeat that a few times. Controlled by the aristocracy, who used this sacred knowledge to maintain their status. These engraved mirrors show the process of Horus specie to mediate between the mortal and divine realms. On the right, we see the Greek soothsayer Calchas as an Etruscan who was hunched over a liver held in his left hand. He's interpreting the will of the gods, reading the liver. On the left, we see Tages. He is standing, the second from the right, the boy god, who is tutoring others in the art, especially the one to the left, the bearded man thoughtfully with his hand to his chin. Now, interesting, both prop a foot on a stone, signaling this mediation. They are present in the divine realm with the liver, and they literally have one foot in the earthly realm. The mirror on the left also reminds us of the intensive training necessary to become part of this priesthood. But we don't have just visual representations of priests and mythological figures performing Horus specie. We have an actual object that was meant to train the priests in this art. This oddly shaped bronze piece is a model of a liver, and perhaps a sheep's liver, with lobes and protuberances and all. Its surface is inscribed with divisions, each one containing the name of an Etruscan deity, some with more than one. Along the edge, 16 divisions fill the space, which is likely in reference to the 16 divisions of the Etruscan sky, each controlled by a specific deity. And then in the center, another 24 divisions. So Horus specie was a finely developed craft in the Etruscan world, and the diviners had to know which deities occupied which parts of the livers and interpret their divine will by what feature, what blemish maybe on the liver appeared in what part. It was far more evolved than our magic 8-ball. But what's also interesting about this is it comes from such a late period. This is the 1st century BC, maybe the 2nd century BC. Either way, this is a late period in Etruscan history, long after Roman expansion. And it shows that the art went on to become continued as an important facet of Etruscan religion, but it also became an important facet of Roman religion. The depictions of the priests show their function as mediators between the gods and men. At right, fresco from the Francois tomb, we see the aristocrat Saties about to perform an auspicium, which is the reading of a flight of a bird that his dwarf at the right is about to release. The distinctive clothing as well of all of these, the statues of these priests and of Saties, this distinctive clothing marks them off as separate, special, higher than the rest of society. The priest was not just a religious figure, but was a person of political or secular importance and duties. We have a great sarcophagus of one of these elite priests who was so proud of his role as a mediator that he listed his life achievements. We have an autobiography inscribed in this stone scroll in front of him. And it includes a phrase suggesting that he wrote a book on Horusification, and it also refers to his wonderful life serving the gods, such as Pacha or Fufluns, Katha, and Kulsu, these Etruscan deities from the 3rd century BC. Now, these priesthoods and the ritual calendars that they followed continued well into the Roman Republican period. This remarkable find is a ritual calendar written for an Etruscan city. The only reason it survives today is because somehow it made its way to Egypt and winding up a mummy. It was a mummy wrap. While its translation is spotty, as is its preservation, it seems to have to do with informing the priest of the boundaries of whatever city for which it was written. The priesthood remained an exclusive class in this later period as well. This dates between the 3rd and the 1st centuries BC. And the priesthood required special religious knowledge and literacy, and again, inextricable to the politics of the city. Only a select few controlled the religion. Now so we see that there's a continuity from the earliest 9th, 8th, 7th centuries down to the 3rd to 1st centuries BC, in spite of Greek influences infiltrating Italy. The Greeks colonized Italy as early as the 8th century BC, bringing with them their heroes and anthropomorphic deities. To be sure, the contact impacted Etruscan religion greatly, but there was not wholesale acceptance and adoption of the influence, but instead a sort of retranslation and adaptation of certain ones that the Etruscans found particularly meaningful. This explains the strong preference, for example, of particular Greek heroes depicted in Etruscan contexts. For example, Achilles was very popular, very meaningful, and this was likely due to his role in the Trojan War cycle, which of course culminated in the Trojan prince Aeneas coming to Italy, something that the Etruscans knew about and they actually celebrated. So we have the Françoises at left, which was found in Chiusi in Italy, but it is a Greek import. It's a celebration of Achilles. In the middle registers, it details deities visiting Peleus and Thetis, his parents, and on the top and the bottom, scenes from Achilles' life and death. A tomb fresco from Tarquinia is strictly Etruscan, and it depicts Achilles lying in wait for the Trojan prince Troilus. So of course, as I said, these stories were well known to the Etruscans, taken and retranslated to make sense of Etruscan context, and other heroes likely were depicted in the same way, such as Odysseus and Heracles, not because they were Greek per se, but because their stories could fit Etruscan narratives. The Etruscan gods, retaining their names and spheres of influence, developed anthropomorphic forms, and they found counterparts in their Greek peers that arrived in Italy. Temples rose. The temples took their form from local familiar architecture, not Greek, to house the gods. But still, these places in nature that had been sacred remained so and still received offerings. Statues of the gods were made, like the masterpieces of terracotta sculpture found at Veii at the Porta Naccio temple, including this, we call them the Apollo, or in Etruscan, Aplu. These are not Greek deities, they are Etruscan deities, possibly syncretized or assimilated with similar Greek deities. Right, now this statue itself shows obvious stylistic affinities to Greek sculpture at the same time, as the side-by-side comparisons with a Greek chorus demonstrates. Now, the more fluid movement of the Etruscan Apollo is quite evident, right? But this is due to the materials. Terracotta is lighter and more plastic than marble, and the chorus would simply break if his movement was so active. This is not a Greek deity, however, as much as this Apollo moniker marks it as one. More likely it is Aplu, an Etruscan god with similar traits. I'm talking about Italy as an Italian international stage, and the best example of this is at Pyrgi. Now, this was a coastal port run by the city of Caire. And I've got a map coming up. I'll show you where Caire is and Tarquinia. Here, two monumental temples greeted Greek, Phoenician, and other sailors who interacted with the Etruscans living and working there. The first temple was Temple B, the one on the right. It was built about 510 BC, and it does take on a curious form. It is in the style of a Greek temple, peripteral with a central cella, very familiar to the Greek sailors coming in. But it has Etruscan deities as the decorative elements, the acroteria. So it is a little bit of both. Now in 460 BC, a second temple, Temple A, was built, and it was much more imposing, larger than the first, and it was built in the local Tuscan temple form. Now, the reason for this is that recent economic and political problems may have informed the decisions of building a new temple and making it in the style of something local. The Etruscans were at this point in 460 BCE in a state of decline, having lost much of their supremacy of the sea and their trade routes after major naval defeats about 20 years earlier. So the new temple may be a good way to reassert Etruscan dominance of the region, a pulling back sort of during their recovery. But most surprising here is what appears on a series of gold foil tablets that were dedicated with the earlier temple B, and which was later ritually buried. Here they are, the real gold tablets, and drawing on the left, and you can see they are in Phoenician and Etruscan texts. The tablets say more or less the same thing. The tyrant of Caire, Thafariae Velunas, dedicated the temple to Astarte, or maybe Uni Astarte, the assimilated version of Etruscan Uni, who is like Hera, the mother god, and Phoenician Astarte. Because he dedicates this because she has, and hopefully will continue to, show him favor. It's a quid pro quo relationship, or in Latin, do ut des. I give so that you will give. Again, there remains here no distinction between civic, political, and religious life. The aristocracy, here a tyrant, controls contact with the gods, and he reaps the rewards. Now, in the pediment of the later Temple A, we have a very interesting square relief that adorns the end of the central roof beam. And this terrible scene belongs to the story of the seven against two brothers battling each other for control of the Greek city of Thebes. Made popular in Greece in many dramatic plays. And what we see is Zeus, or Etruscan Tinia, in the center, throwing his lightning bolt at Capanius, who is crying out. Capanius was attacking Thebes and said, not even Zeus can stop me from taking Thebes. And Zeus says, we'll see about that. On the left, we see Athena, or Menvra in Etruscan at the side, and she has a drink of immortality in her hand that she was going to bring to the mortally wounded Titius, but she is horrified by his behavior, and she departs. And you can see at the bottom there, Titius is the one biting the head of fallen Melanopus to eat his brain. So this Theban cycle was as popular in Etruria as the Trojan cycle. They were fascinated by the seers that appear in the story of the seven against Thebes, like Amphiaraos and Tiresias. Well, because prophecy was an important part of their religion. The Theban and Trojan cycles and other myths were highly regarded because they dealt with genealogy and ancestors, especially the ones that included Italy, prophecy. But it's really difficult to interpret why this was chosen to be the scene on the temple. Perhaps it expresses condemnation of the previous tyrannical regime of Thafariae and reveals a message communicated by Caire of the vast political change that occurred after his removal. Now, although the Etruscans were open to the international presence on the coast, their temple architecture also indicates that they're protective of their territory. They use temples strategically to mark off liminal spaces, boundaries between territories, the urban boundary from rural boundary, and also the Etruscan boundary, the boundary between the Etruscan world and the international world. And this map shows the distribution of Etruscan rural temples that I made when I was living in this region. And I overlaid it onto the map of an ancient road network. And it's really fascinating. You can see Pyrgi on the coast. You can see Tarquinia up in the upper left, and Caire in the southeast. What's most interesting is a band of sanctuaries encircling Pyrgi inland and up the coast. 3 Etruscan temples surround the heavily traveled coastal road at north. Those are numbers 14, 15, and 16. And inland, there was a band as well. And I'm looking particularly at 17, 18, 19, 20, 21, and 23. These all occupied roads leading inland from Pyrgi, right? The temple locations really were meant to communicate a message from the local community to these outsiders. You are within the boundaries of the Cairetans. The temples were physical manifestations of the Etruscan identity and the control over their space. Now, despite the Hellenizing trend in Etruscan religion, we cannot see the phenomenon as one of acculturation, with Etruscans becoming more Greek with the increasing contact. Their use of Greek myths and motifs was not simple adoption, but adaptation, a retranslation of Greek meanings to make them relevant in this local context. Our interpretations are somewhat different when we examine the Roman occupation of Etruscan regions. Participation meant, again, acculturation, the Romanization of the other. So I want to analyze this inference through a massively popular ritual, the so-called Etrusco-Latial-Campanian, or ELC votive tradition. Oops. Now, the spread of the ELC votive tradition was a unique and marked phenomenon during the Middle Republican period in central Italy, from the 4th to the late 2nd, maybe early centuries BCE. Anatomical terracotta models depicting hands and feet, heads, breasts, phalloi, internal organs like uteri and hearts, among others, were dedicated as sanctuaries, part of a cult of healing and fertility. Because the spread was contemporaneous with the expansion of Rome over the peninsula, the material remains of the ritual tradition has often been used as a metric for the concomitant cultural assimilation of the Italic peoples under Rome, the religious Romanization of Italy. Some scholars view the ritual as a Roman one, strictly, moving out of the center into the peripheries. Its adoption by the local people, signaling their acceptance of Roman culture and ideologies. Others argue that the adoption of the tradition is not equivalent to assimilation, rightly. Various motivations can drive participation, and various meanings can inform the votive objects. The votives I want to look at are coming from the sanctuary of Grascetta dei Cavallari, right in between Tarquinia and Caere in the Tolfa mountain range. Built on a saddle between two mountains, it would have been frequented most commonly by travelers crossing from one territory to another. So it's an important political site as well, a place of mediation and a place of assertion of territorial control. The site is made up of 3 structures. Just briefly look at them. A large, rather small, they call it the Tempieto, the little temple, the large building there where the ritual activity was focused. Next to this, we have a smaller building. It seems to have benches running around 3 of the 4 sides. And a square at the center, which some people identify as an altar, a hearth, or a base of a table used in ritual dining. And then at the north, building B was open on the south side, and its function isn't really known. Perhaps it was used to store cult instruments. Now, a poorly preserved antifix, which is at the bottom right there, and Bucaro fragments found here show that frequentation occurred as far back as the 6th century BCE. But the collection of anatomical votives that I'm going to look at appeared between the late 4th and the 2nd centuries BC. What were these votives? Well, there are votives that were meant to assist in conceiving or rearing children. This was very common, and hundreds of these types of votives, like the phallus, a breast, and the uterus, seen here coming from Grascetta, they can be found at any sanctuary. Very, very common. For healing, we have hands and feet in terracotta, right? If you're working in an agricultural society, hands and feet are prone to injury, and they are most in need of divine attention. Consequently, they are the most common votive types in this ELC tradition. A selection of those recovered at Grascetta dei Cavallari appear here. There are a few others. These are just some of the interesting ones, these hands and the feet. Now, they are mold made. They are meant to facilitate mass production. They are rendered pretty naturalistically, except for that one on the bottom there. That one's interesting. There's one exactly like that at a place called Volci. It's a very strange style, but they're very natural. In fact, how easy would it be? You want to make a mold of a foot. What you do is you put your foot on a block of wood and put the clay on the foot. So what you're looking at the right is actually a real foot that they used as the model to create the mold. You can even see, if you look closely, veins in this. So very natural, but there's something curious also among the votive feet at Grascetta dei Cavallari. We also get these highly stylized wheel-made feet, not mold-made, with toes splayed and deeply inside toenails. We refer to these as the indigenous style, likely crafted at a potter's workshop nearby and sold for presentation at this particular sanctuary. As we see in a minute, they share some unique features with their votive head counterparts. So yes, heads were thought to represent the worshiper, him or herself. And they appear in sanctuaries throughout the ELC area. The great majority are mold-made, like these on the left here. They're mass-produced. Indeed, it's not uncommon to find replicas of a head at different sites. Stylistically, they navigate the currents of Hellenic aesthetic traditions. So closely, in fact, that it is often possible to estimate relative dates of these heads based on their likenesses to Greek sculpture. At Grascetta dei Cavallari, there were 4 Hellenic-style heads, 3 of which are pictured here, and they demonstrate a close affinity with concomitant Greek sculptural traditions. But another group of heads are quite remarkable, and they are on the right. They too were crafted in the so-called indigenous style. The process of creation is very different. They are wheel-made rather than mold-made. The heads start off as any normal pot would. Once the form is shaped, the bottom of the pot was rounded to form the cranium, and then the pot was turned upside down. The rim of the pot was now the neck of the head. Rudimentary facial features were applied onto the surface in high relief, semicircular ears projecting perpendicularly, bands of clay in a T motif form the nose and brow, clay cords encircle clay pellets for the eyes, circle cords for the mouths, and really interesting, chins that descend from the lower lip, almost like extended drooping tongues. They're certainly evocative, but evocative of what? For what reason did the potters, I say potters, I see very clearly 2 distinct hands making the one on the right and the one on the left. Why did they create this style? For what reason? Now, previous scholarship about the sanctuary and its votives sees little reason for their style and little meaning behind them. Consequently, they are described in terms of what they lack. That is a more conventional and agreeable Hellenic look and feel. Thus, they've been described as crude and rude. They're the products of a local workshop that made on request small fictile votives, this is important, without any cultural link. And they are executed with such awkwardness that they betray a total absence of, again, important Hellenic aesthetic models. Insinuation is that they lack an aesthetic and cultural link because they do not adhere to the stylistic tradition of the more Hellenized products. The heads are anomalies. Thus, as anomalies, their formal attributes can be noted and described, but attempts to interpret meaning or function of the style seems futile because they are spontaneous, uncultivated creations arising from some cultural black hole, untouched by a shared aesthetic canon. Therefore, they can be disregarded because nothing further can be gleaned from them other than they serve the same purpose as other votive offerings. But are they anomalies made by unskilled provincial craftsmen? One way to answer the question is simply to search for similar examples at other sanctuaries. Now, although in the minority, the style does appear with relative frequency at many other sites. I call your attention to 4 contemporaneous examples here, 3 heads and 1 face plaque with similar exaggerated and stylized features. And the scholarship discusses the indigenous style of these sanctuary spaces with similar tendencies as we saw at Grascetta dei Cavallari. They are crude, they are rude, and their style is generally excused or written off in one of 3 ways. And I want to look at these 3 ways right now. The first I call the socioeconomic model. Scholars like to write them off as displaying the sort of economic and cultural poverty of these subaltern classes. And this poverty is reflected in the poor workmanship of their material culture. Without the resources to purchase anything better, furthermore, people became indifferent to the artistic quality of the objects. Well, why is this wrong? Our modern evaluation of the artistic merit of an ancient object should not be the gauge that measures the object's material worth. Were the molded Hellenic heads of greater value, more expensive? One could just as easily argue that the indigenous style here was in fact more expensive. There was a greater expenditure of labor. Individually handmade on a potter's wheel rather than mold made and mass produced, they took longer to make. They required more raw materials. They were larger, they had thicker walls, simply they used up more clay. Determining the value of one votive type relative to all others, furthermore, isn't even possible when we don't even have the full range of votives offered at the site. It's simply not known to us today, everything that was dedicated there. Now, the second model, socioeconomic, let's go to the religious model. Scholars like to say that the devotion of the worshippers supersedes aesthetic considerations. The rather crude heads were acceptable offerings because the dedicants were more interested in the efficacy of the offerings. How well did they work as a tangible expression of their religiosity? So they didn't even concern themselves with the value, their value as a work of art. Well, the religious model doesn't work because it's not the relative value of the object being measured, but scholars are sort of measuring the relative piety of its bearer. To argue that the indigenous heads were dedicated with some more sincere devotion, and thus they didn't care about the style, implies that the mold-made Hellenic style heads were somehow dedicated for reasons other than piety. It is too great a stretch to correlate a votive's formal qualities to religious piety. Does not equal piety. Now, the third model I want to bring up is the resistance model. This understands the indigenous style as evidence of a concerted effort to repel outside religious influences at local sanctuaries. The indigenous style heads point to a successful effort by the indigenes to keep foreign styles from infiltrating their religious traditions. But it is widely agreed that Roman expansion in the Republican period was non-interventionalist. The ELC ritual tradition, while probably arriving as a result of Roman expansion, was not forced upon anybody, not the local peoples. Participation was not compulsory. And yet, it's obvious that local peoples did participate, right? That they would shun a particular style simply because it was foreign and unfamiliar, and at the same time take up a whole new foreign mode of worship, or that arrived from the outside, seems incongruous. So if not for these reasons, why were these heads with this style dedicated as sanctuaries alongside the Hellenic style? What sort of symbolic valence made the style appropriate in this context? And how can we attempt to read the symbolism of the style today? I wanted to demonstrate now that the style, far from being anomalous, derived actually from a very strong and unbroken cultural link. The style was one that functioned and had tangible meaning to these people who regularly produced and used it for centuries. Here, I'm going to bring up 3 examples of the style through time. Human face plaques were applied to 7th and 6th century BCE Bucaro vessels in workshops, mainly in central Italy, Chiusi. Well, Volci is pretty close to our area, or Vieto. And they exhibit many of the same characteristics, including the brow and nose coming together to form a T motif or bird's wing motif, the nose in high relief, the stylized mouth, prominent chin. Although found usually in funerary contexts, the vessels were likely used, as Gillian Braithwaite suggests, in the living world as well. They were more than decorative elements on these vessels, and the upper left one is actually a brazier. They likely serve to protect the users of the vessel, both in life and the afterlife. Now, another example is the Gorgon antifix, a favorite motif in Etruscan temple decoration. It appeared as early as the 7th century BCE, and similar stylized features are apparent. The large mouths and eyes, the T motif. The Gorgon in the upper center demonstrates very well how the style is interpreted and recast in an indigenous format. A further connection to the Gorgon antifix and the votive heads is that prominent chin. Its resemblance to the Gorgon tongues protruding downwards from the mouth may indicate a retranslation of this feature. Now, where were these? These were dedicated or erected on temples to function as apotropaic devices to protect the temples, to ward off evil, and keep the temples from harm. The third example is the Etruscan face beaker, which circulated around southern Etruria down to Rome in the 6th to 5th centuries BCE. Stylized human faces were applied and modeled by hand onto the bodies of bucro vessels, were occasionally painted onto black and white Etrusco-Corinthian ware. Around the 5th century, they disappear from the archaeological record. But then again, in the 2nd to the early 1st century, we see a reappearance of this in Roman face pots. Now, so there's a break of several centuries. Where did it go? Braithwaite argues that the later face pots from Rome, the Roman face pots, descended from the same tradition as the Etruscan face beakers. The period where they disappear coincides with this ELC votive tradition and the dedication of our heads. Could it be that the tradition does continue, but just now in the sanctuaries, merely turned upside down as votive heads and not face pots and face beakers? According to Braithwaite, these Etruscan face beakers with known contexts all come from ritual deposits apparently buried on the occasions of temple rebuilding. Their function was to protect the temple's structural integrity during construction. Now, although coming from different domains of Etruscan society, the three examples do occupy a similar sphere of influence. They are apotropaic or protective devices. The bucro face plaques to protect the persons using the vessels or buried with the vessels. The Gorgon antifixes to protect the temples. The face beakers found in foundation trenches to ensure and protect temple construction. Is it possible or appropriate to transfer this symbolic valence over to the indigenous style votive heads? Absolutely. As pars pro toto representations of the mortal petitioner, these heads communicated requests for divine protection. What visual language better communicates this petition than one already used for centuries to already ensure divine protection? The indigenous style heads then take as their cue these sources where style expresses apotropaic protective force. And perhaps the style communicates on another level, portraying an elevated way of being, signaling the transformative ascension from the mundane physical world of man to the enigmatic world of the divinities, where in this heightened state, communication could take place, requests heard, and one would hope heeded. Why, finally, was this ritual tradition received so completely around central and southern Italy when Rome was also expanding into the territory? Well, the participation was so common, the ritual was so popular, simply because everybody could participate. The ELC tradition offered to all participants a greater control over their own religious affairs. It represented a more democratized form of worship. It engendered a new religious egalitarianism in which all classes enjoyed equal opportunity to relate with gods who had been unreachable without the mediation of the aristocratic priesthood class. Such access might have been more attractive to the local groups during the period of change brought on by Roman imperialism. Ingrid Edlund argues that the sanctuaries where the votives were placed represented a, quote, point of stability within an otherwise politically uncertain setting, unquote. If the locals did feel a loss of control as a result of Roman expansion into their territory, they gained at least a large amount of control in their religious affairs. The ELC tradition did not, however, replace traditional religion in places like the Tolfa Mountains or anywhere else in Etruria. We've already seen the continuity of these foundational beliefs spanning through the Greek period and through the Roman imperialism. So local participation in this religion should not be read as cultural homogeneity resulting from the religious Romanization of Italy. At the various sanctuaries, the indigenous style appearing alongside the Hellenic style was an effective visual pronouncement of the continuity of traditional belief systems and styles. Here was the intersection of old and new traditions, and visitors at the sanctuaries could assert their own cultural identity by dedicating a votive in the appropriate style, or at least be reminded of it by viewing those already displayed. The voice of the indigenous populations was still audible, and their agency was still active. Thank you.
Thank you. That was wonderful. We would have an audience clapping at this stage, but as always, it's rather disconcerting to be here on virtually. So we unfortunately have to imagine that, but an extremely interesting and thought-provoking talk, loaded with a lot of different ideas. We are open for questions now from those of you who might wish to ask something of our speaker. If you would like to put something in the chat box, or we could also probably raise your hand. There's a small enough number of us that if someone wants to ask a direct question, we can unmute you, I think. In any case, I love the idea of these side-by-side religions, allowed under the Romans to exist. I guess, well, I have a number of questions, but so what you're positing is that Rome recognized this and would allow it, where I guess there's a certain amount of flexibility already built into Roman religion. And is this a kind of similar take on it across Italy?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, when Rome comes in and conquers them politically, they cannot force meaningful change on religious practice. I mean, as powerful as the Roman army was, they're nothing against, conquered peoples around the empire, upset that their entire religion has been subsumed by Roman. So for this ELC tradition, the map I showed, there's 230 cult sites, and that was published in the 90s, and there are far more discoveries. And so particularly the ELC tradition is much more expansive than even that map shows. And I believe, right, when it arrived, just they had the power and the freedom and the agency to look at it and accept it or not. I don't know if is that answering your question?
Yeah, I guess, do you think it's unusual then that such a, I mean, the Etruscans are, I think, a conservative people, but my understanding of them is that they're also open to change, and they do adapt certain other styles. So are you saying that we have sort of parallel traditions going on here?
Absolutely, parallel traditions. And I'm not saying that if you're Etruscan, you had to dedicate an Etruscan style head. It was an option. It was an option, and it does come down because that style made sense to them. But yeah, the one thing I can't say is the Hellenic style was dedicated by Romans or Greeks, and the indigenous style was strictly indigenes, Etruscans, right? They also had a choice, but that choice was available to them. And it was there, and absolutely they would see that style and they would recognize it from what they're seeing all around them. And for them, they would absolutely, I think, recognize the symbolic power of that style.
We do have a question now in the chat box from Melita Loper. She says, very interesting talk. Thank you. I've also seen votive body parts from ancient Greek sites associated with the Asclepiae. Could this practice have been adopted or adapted by the Romans from the Greeks?
Yes, hard yes. We can see if we look at the sort of the history of this style, we can see this was a Greek practice that probably the Romans adopted, and then as they were expanding, that expanded with them, and it just became a phenomenon. But absolutely, this was not limited strictly to Italy. There are just wonderful deposits of very, very similar, except those local style, that indigenous style, from healing sanctuaries of Greece. Yeah.
So again, if you have questions, please put them into the chat box. One of the things I was curious about is how long does this style last, or do we even know? Does this style continue on into the Roman Empire, or is there a point when it simply sort of vanishes?
It vanishes, and it occurs in the late Republic, and it's so hard to figure out why. And I think it has to do with individuals, Roman individuals, Caesar and Sulla taking over, and what we see is almost like they replace the deities. There's something in the political milieu of the mid to early 1st century BC that causes it just to stop abruptly. And I think it's what's happening in Italy, the civil wars, and you get the rise of the individual, and people are looking now to individuals who are almost like deities. But I mean, we people discuss this, and it's a mystery why after the early 1st century, it just stops. And we don't see it in the Roman Empire. No, it stops. Yeah.
Someone has asked about the black cups with the faces that were shown. Where are those located? What museums are those in?
These here, these.
I love those, the face cups.
Where are they? I don't know. They are in, these were made, well, they're all over. I'm really not sure. I do not know where they would be located. I've never seen one in person. I've seen the Roman face pots. The one in the upper right is at Pompeii. And the one on the lower left is also northern Campania, maybe Capua. The Etruscan face beakers, I wish I knew. The one on the left I took from an early excavation report, early 20th century, and I don't know where that one is, but I've actually never seen one in person.
Do we have any other questions this evening? There's a lot to unpack here. I certainly was very interested. I had never seen before the face plaques, the actual the sort of the tiles with the faces on them. Is that a purely if we could see that again, that was very interesting. Is that a purely Etruscan style of votive? Because I've never quite seen those before. It goes back, I think, a little further. Yes. Oh,
this here.
Yes.
This one is from Corvaro, which is somewhat of an Etruscan site. It's close. It's more inland, and actually never seen one. Well, I've seen face masks like this before. Usually they have nail holes in them, and they would have been hung up on the walls of sanctuaries. And that's also a Greek tradition. Many of the votives, anatomical votives in Greece would have been hung up on the walls. So they were the votives, but not set down, but hung up on the walls. But much less common than these other votive heads.
Okay, there's still some time to ask some questions. Okay. Are there any examples of Etruscan death masks?
No, that would be lovely. No, this is really, I mean, it would make sense. They were very interested in genealogy and family, but at least none that survives. And we know that the Romans were very into this. But of course, most face masks would have been made of maybe wax or something that would have decayed in the archaeological record. And so we never really see much of any physical face masks anymore. But I honestly can't think of any example of them using death masks like that.
Wasn't there a recent Etruscan tomb that was found within the last couple of years with a pair of silver hands in it?
Yeah, right.
It was, of course, much
right.
earlier.
Right, very elite. Not sure if this was also part of this dedication, but if it was probably an very elite person having made them. But instead of dedicating them, they were buried with him. But yeah, no, not sure about the function of them. But yeah.
Okay. Cindy Bell is asking whether or not the Gorgon heads, she says they seem almost Chinese. Do they date to the pre-Roman Etruscan period or afterwards?
These date to, the one on the left dates to the 6th, 5th century BC. This one comes from Veii. The indigenous one, the one on the upper right, the upper center, comes from the northern Campania, southern Latium region, just south of Rome, and also dates to the 5th to 4th century. The one on the below is older. This one is an archaic, about 7th to 6th century. So as soon as and this is also, you can also see these in Greek temple architecture. But really, as soon as the Etruscans started building temples, one of the most popular motifs was the Gorgon head. You can see, these represent several centuries. From as early as the 7th century, you see them in Etruscan, but possibly in the Greek world, they predate that.
Regarding your own excavations of Roman villas with Etruscan religious sites sort of embedded in it, which we were talking about before the talk, have you found evidence of these indigenous styles in your own excavations?
No. Unfortunately, where's my map? I have a right in the center, right at number 17, is a star. And that's a Roman villa I've taken Oregon students to. And this villa was built just feet away from an older Etruscan temple. They completely robbed it out. We have a nice footprint of the temple, and then they covered over the temple. And they used the land over the temple as an agricultural field. So this is the only Etruscan temple I myself have excavated. I studied Gradascetta dei Cavalari, but this was excavated pre and post World War II. So I didn't find any myself. But the temple at that star at number 17, inside the temple, not even the floor. They took out the floor. So we have walls going up maybe a couple feet, a meter. But everything else was completely rubbed out. We did not find a single votive object inside of it because it had been so thoroughly cleaned out. When that temple dates to maybe 3rd century, 4th century BC, and then the villa right next to it is 2nd century AD. And in building the villa, yeah, they just cleaned it out. So unfortunately, not a single votive comes from that. That's too bad. It would have been fun.
All right. Last call for questions. Do we have anyone who'd like to ask a final question before we thank our speaker and let him head off to his evening? No, some thank yous. And certainly a thank you from me. We are grateful for your willingness to do another online virtual talk. We're all getting a little tired of them, but this was wonderful. And I certainly picked up quite a bit. And we're really pleased to have you. And we will get you up here in person
Yeah,
at some point soon when we can, and perhaps hear more about your work from Pompeii.
Great. Oh, I'd be happy to. Yeah.
Yeah. So imagine now again, more clapping. This is usually okay. More clapping going on. And again, a very strong thank you. For those of you who have joined us this evening, please remember that we have our lectures on the 3rd Thursday of the month. That is next March 17th. Cyrus Conrad will be back this time to talk about World War II, the bridge over the River Kwai, and prehistoric Thailand archaeology. Thank you all for joining us. Thank you again, Dr. Dicus, and we will see you all next month. Take care, everybody, and be safe. Yeah. Bye-bye.